Hello everybody, welcome to EPG Pathshala, continuing the lessons in culture studies. This is Pramod Kenair of the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad. We are going to today look at the first primary concept in culture studies, and that's the idea of culture itself. What does the word culture mean? What does it mean in traditional interpretations, and what does it mean for us working within cultural studies? The word culture actually comes from the Latin word that implies cultivation. Essentially, it meant farming, to till the land, to help grow things. So its etymological history is actually rooted in human endeavor to make something, to produce something through serious effort. And it's very closely aligned with the word husbandry in the traditional sense of the term that comes down to us from the Latin roots. The term eventually begins to mean something else. From the agricultural production that the word originally meant, it began to mean anything that humans have built through their efforts. What we now understand as culture, therefore, has two primary distinctive, shall we say, interpretations. One is what the biologists, the plant sciences people use to speak about culturing something, a life form in a petri dish, in a laboratory, in a piece of equipment. The other is what people in the social sciences and humanities understand as the entire field of human endeavor, the entire field of human making, production of meaning. So culture is a set of practices, as in human practices done over a period of time with specific meaning, symbolic significance for its practitioners and for the others. This is the sense in which we will be using it in cultural studies. Culture as a set of practices, human efforts directed at producing a certain kind of meaning, which might take several forms. The question of what culture means is this broad defined area of human practices, but its symbolic significance of various specific forms such as film or comics varies from region to region, language to language, ethnic group to ethnic group, and of course century to century. So what we understand as a cultural practice is determined by a set of social conventions, norms, and in many cases laws. So what constitutes a piece of, a practice of, a kind of manifestation of culture is not consistent over any period of time, any length of time. And what constitutes specific forms of acceptable culture also changes with a period of time. So what we need to understand is human efforts at making anything. This could be a piece of pottery, this could be a film, this could be a lesson such as this, any educational program, it could be architecture, buildings, whatever, changes with time because humans constantly battle over what things mean. For us in cultural studies, it's important to understand that culture is something that is not fixed, it's not stable. What do we mean by this? It means very simply what makes sense for one period, what makes sense for one region does not make the same sense in another region or another period of time. So culture is not fixed. Culture is in fact something we fight over, we disagree about, we have arguments about, we have laws on one side, as in formal codified laws, but also social norms on the other, where we don't necessarily have laws, but by convention we agree this is how things are. So culture is a contested field. Culture and cultural practices, culture and symbols of culture, culture and meanings are fields of negotiation. What this means is students looking at culture need to understand that culture is something humans disagree about, fight over, and culture is never stable. It's not a category where we can immediately say, oh, that is culture. Punk does not look like culture to a lot of people here in the eastern part of the world. But our traditional practices in various corners of the country, which include body piercing, for instance, sacrifices of the body in certain ways, would appear strange to another cultural tradition. So meanings in culture are things we fight over. And as we shall say eventually, we fight over them because culture is about identity. It is about a frame, a set of practices that help me define myself, for me to understand myself, to locate myself within a larger group, in my life world. So it's important to understand that culture is something not stable, it's something we fight over, and it's a constantly changing dynamic field where various forces, stakeholders, seek to negotiate what they understand as culture. This evolves over a period of time, over centuries in some cases, and what is acceptable at one point in time is not acceptable in later periods of time. Now, the minute I say that it evolves over a period of time, it means also the question of acceptability of a cultural practice. Why does a particular cultural practice survive, thrive, others die out? This brings us to the core focus in cultural studies, and that is, how does one define a culture as acceptable and some as unacceptable? How does one define a culture as legitimate and licit and others as illegitimate and illicit? Traditionally, culture has been organized into the culture of a small elite group of people with economic power, with cultural power. Those of you who have been following the lessons would immediately be able to connect this to the point we have already noted about economic foundation and superstructure being culture. That's where this argument comes from. Culture is a superstructure built on an economic base. Those who have economic power, their culture will remain superior. Their culture will acquire status, monetary benefits, prestige, and all sorts of other benefits. Those people who possess economic power also possess cultural power. That's our bottom line here. And their culture will be established as high culture, acceptable culture, prestigious culture. All other cultural forms, all other cultural practices, cultural experiences, cultural ways of knowing will be called low culture. Now, this is where the important intervention is made by cultural studies. Cultures established as high cultural forms are in positions of authority, respectability, and then there is the low cultural form. The irony here is the so-called low culture is what is the culture of the masses, the culture of the larger group of people. So you will immediately, as students, wonder, but why is the culture of the larger group of people being ignored? Why is it being marginalized? And why is the culture of a group of people being touted as acceptable culture? Why not this? For instance, why is it that we think we should read Wordsworth in literature but not Agatha Christie in a classroom? Why should we think we must watch Satyajit Ray films and not Karan Johar films in a classroom, in film studies? Why is it that niche artworks such as those by, say, Picasso are read, but not street art or poster campaigns by student groups, by protesters, by roadside artists? Why do we say, oh, that's not art? See, the point is, one way of controlling the subordinated classes, the subjugated classes, is to say that they are also culturally backward. Therefore, their culture does not count. This means, in short, we are saying those who are economically on the margins of society are also culturally on the margins of society, that their culture does not count. Why should we take it seriously? On the other hand, the small group of people who have economic power in that particular society, in that social order, will say, look, our culture is better. Let's take an example. In the period of colonialism, the mode of implementing imperial power was not necessarily through military and legal measures. It was also done through what we now understand as cultural imperialisms, where the British or the Europeans said, let's not bother with native culture. I mean, look at how primitive they are. Their art is bad, their writing is bad, their language is bad. But on the other hand, look at Western culture. Look at the great Greek writers. Look at the great Latin poets. This is true culture. Over a period of time, this idea that European culture is superior, is better, is modern, is something the Indians, the colonized subjects also begin to assimilate. And the subjects say, you know, they are right. That's superior culture. Now, the minute we use this culture as a framework to divide and subjugate people, culture has stepped into the realm of politics. Which is why cultural studies is interested in the politics of culture. Culture is not simply about making films and walking through the streets looking at to do, say, window shopping, to participate in a football match. No. Culture is about the organization of people into acceptable, unacceptable, respectable, non-respectable, vernacular and official. Culture divides. Culture organizes. And how this is done is the subject of culture studies. Let me add one more significant point to this. The organization of society, therefore, is not based only on the economic processes, mechanics of production. The organization of a society is also based on the organization of cultural forms. So when we say, oh, it's wonderful that we should all be reading good literature and therefore we should read only Shakespeare or Wordsworth or T.S. Eliot. Oh, but you know, you really can't be reading Agatha Christie or Enid Blyton. It's not respectable. It's not culture at all. The minute you say that, the people who consume that kind of literature, the people who read that kind of literature, are relegated to the cultural backgrounds of a social order. So you are economically disempowered and culturally disenfranchised. Their cultures do not get recognition. Their cultures do not get visibility because the upper class cultures will say, that's useless, that's rubbish, that's third rate. This is done using aesthetic standards, supposedly. Now the irony is, and this is what is interesting about cultural studies and the work it has done over the past several decades, several of the people whom we now read as classics, and I will speak from the literature point of view, as a discipline that is, people whom we say, oh, they are classics, but there are also the popular writers. The people who became classics were originally popular writers. The best example would be William Shakespeare. When Shakespeare's plays were staged in the Globe in England in the 16th and early 17th century, people would stand in the rain waiting for a ticket to get into the Globe. Masses of people would come to watch him. He was the first popular author in the English literary history canon. We now think of him as a classic. He was not. He was, in fact, if you want to use an analogy, he was the Chetan Bhagat of his age. He was the Karan Johar of his age because he was able to pull in 500 people into the theatre every single day for every single show. That's how he made his money. He was popular. Now you might very well say, but then how does he become a classic? How does he become an important author? How does he become the icon of English literary history? Well, that's what we understand as the politics of culture. How does Shakespeare move from the popular, the mass, higher and higher into elites? That process is what culture studies is interested in. The market forces that determine who reads him, where it is staged. For instance, if Shakespeare was staged in the lawns outside, as opposed to being staged at the Lincoln Center in New York City or at the Athenaeum in London, would it be the same Shakespeare? When it's staged in the roadside Maidan or just outside a football field, everybody comes and watches. How many of us can afford a Lincoln Center ticket or the Royal Albert Hall? Now, Shakespeare works in the Royal Albert Hall. He works here as well. The politics of culture is in operation, so to speak, when we are told, oh, but that being staged in the street is not Shakespeare. Authentic Shakespeare is what happens in the Royal Albert Hall or the Lincoln Center. That is what I meant when I spoke about the politics of culture. That only a Shakespeare play for which people pay a large amount of money is authentic Shakespeare, whereas Shakespeare done out on the road is not authentic Shakespeare. It's frivolous, it's just plain fun. But Shakespeare's plays were about having fun. The politics of culture includes the question of, and this is something we need to tread a little carefully because we don't quite understand the dynamics of early modern England. It involved the system of patronage, which king asked Shakespeare to present. He presented at the court of Queen Elizabeth and King James I. Who paid to watch him? Did the working classes go? To move away from Shakespeare to a contemporary situation, how many people are able to afford a multiplex ticket to watch a film as opposed to a regular movie house? What does a multiplex cost you to make a trip with 4 people or 5 people of a family or a group of friends? That cultural division is actually an economic division. The difference between high and low culture is also therefore not just cultural but economic. People who watch a street play, people who watch a film in a rather simple theater as opposed to a multiplex where you have to buy specific products like KFC for entertainment, where you have certain kinds of shops for your other purchases, where you have certain kinds of game zones and all of that. And then there is the theater where all you get is a cup of tea. This distinction, therefore, between cultural forms and cultural practices is also a distinction between economic consumptions, patterns of consumptions of culture. Now, for cultural studies, the focus is not on elite culture, but on mass and popular culture and how these get marginalized over a period of time, how they get ignored as, oh, not worth looking at or not worth paying attention to. Some of you might be aware that high cultural forms are increasingly being made available in popular cultural forms. For instance, one of the reasons why Shakespeare survives is because Shakespeare has taken many forms, whether it's adaptations, 10 Things I Love About You, or I Hate About You, or versions of The Taming of the Shrew that you now see, Shakespeare in Love, popular films, the comic book Shakespeare, manga Shakespeare versions, adaptations into vernacular languages. That's what keeps the industry of Shakespeare alive. Now, if you think about it, these are not high cultural forms. These are mass forms. Manga Shakespeare, 10 Things I Hate About You, popular romance from Hollywood, as opposed to the Globe staging Shakespeare at the London Olympics a few years ago. All the 36 plays of Shakespeare were staged in several languages from around the world in the London Olympics. Now, that is a very different order of culture, which is the point I'm trying to emphasize. Now, having looked at these major divisions between high and low culture and popular culture, we also need to look at smaller versions of these that occur in cultural studies work. Let's take the example of what I have already proposed to you, street theater. The cultural practices and forms of small groups of people, village communities in a particular region is folk culture. That is the culture of the folk of that particular region, tribe, ethnic group, or whatever you want to think of. Folk culture is the popular culture of that particular area, of that particular community, not necessarily visible outside the frame of that particular geographical region or political grouping. So folk culture is actually the culture of that particular group. It constitutes its cultural memory, its cultural history, and its sense of its own identity. So as you can see, we are moving towards the question of cultural identity. So for the group, it's important that they recognize their folk culture, they participate in it. It is what makes them who they are. It's what gives them their language, their cultural memories, and their identity, their sense of who they are. If you look at folk culture, that's traditionally seen as semi-urban and rural. But urban cultures have their own forms. Think of coffee houses in 18th century England. the Adda in Calcutta city, the kind of multiplex cultures in urban centers that we now see, sports cultures among youth, clubs for sports, for gaming and recreation, more specialized versions of it. Urban culture is a specific form of culture within a particular urban space, which again is organized very differently into high cultural forms and mass or popular cultural forms. So within the urban cultural forms, there is the multiplex going yuppie crowds culture of high consumption, lots of mobility, and a fair interest in the events from around the world. But urban culture also includes a section which we do not even address when we are talking about this. Think of the culture of the commuter trains in Mumbai city. That's also part of urban culture. It's a whole group of people who travel on the same train every day. They develop into a small community on those trains in the period during which they are traveling, and that constitutes a particular cultural group. They come from different walks of life. They come from different language communities, religions, and ethnic groups. But for the duration of the train journey, they are grouped together. It's what increasingly is being referred to in culture studies as cultural citizenship. These are not necessarily elite. These are not necessarily upper class, but they come together because of a shared sense of being together in that compartment on that train journey, or whatever you want to call it. Then, of course, there are national cultures. National cultures are part of and the result of propaganda, national movements, national campaigns. They are very often intersecting with official cultures. Think of national festivals like Republic Day, Independence Day, and things like that. What do they achieve? What do they function as? They function as rallying points for us to make sense of who we are, because that gives us a sense of identity. It gives us a name. Indians, for example, is the name we gather from it. And it brings us together. National cultural forms work on both politics on one hand and sentiment on the other, because we begin to feel a sense of patriotic and national belonging. We begin to sense a togetherness, and national cultures very frequently therefore push us into thinking we are united. We share cultural features. Now you will remember that during the freedom struggle, people like Gandhi and people like Lala Rajpat Rai and Lokmanya Tilak made use of festivals and religious rituals. Tilak famously revived the Ganesh tradition during the October season and said, this is truly an Indian festival. And so he managed to bring people into this. It became what we now identify as a national popular. It was, of course, exclusive, as in it took a Hindu festival and made that as the definable, identifiable national culture, which is basically the kind of tradition that people like Ambedkar begin to eventually resist. But the national cultural form at that point in time, this is pre-independence, became a rallying point. People said, we identify with this. So the national cultural tradition, whether it's in India or the United States or in any part of the world, brings people together. And that is a political act. Once more, we are addressing the politics of culture. Finally, there are the subcultures. Subcultures are small groups of specialized cultural practices where, say, the young, say, an artistic group begins to do certain things that are resisting the domination of a particular cultural practice or form. Subcultures like punk, like riot girls, American ones, street theatre, Sardar Hashmi in India was a famous instance of this, do not fit into the national popular. They don't fit in the high cultural. They create a smaller group of cultural practices that question these elite ones. that tell us things are not quite all right here. So I'm going to give you a different meaning altogether. These groups, subcultural group practices, are important because they offer us a counter idea, a different set of meanings for us to think about. They evaluate, say, the caste system or patriarchy or whatever you want to think about. How do they do this? As in, how do groups talk about their cultural practice, or how do groups resist cultural practices? This is possible only because cultures require a language in which to represent themselves. They need a discourse, a series of narrative mechanisms through which they talk about themselves. Culture works because culture requires representation. Culture requires the language in which they can convey to people, to communicate to people that this is what they should do. When we say representation, we tend to think of it as something unreal and something distant. No. Representation is the putting into language of anything. As in, if there is language, it is representation. There is no representation which does not require a language. And that language could be speech like the one I'm giving you now. It could be written, it could be gestures, it could be visuals, figures, icons, any kind. But culture requires representation because culture otherwise is abstract. It's not something we can understand. So suppose we say, what was the culture of the Aztecs in the ancient world? Or what's the culture of the Inuits in Greenland? There are several ways we can do that. We can go there and read their books. That's one. We can look at the place where they live. We can put together their material objects and say, they use this, they use this, they use this. That's their culture. These things, these material objects are also forms of representation. So we should not think of them as just objects and therefore we can discount. No, objects also are part of a larger linguistic representational process. Okay? Now, having said all this, what does culture do? What culture does is to enable me as an individual, but also me as part of a group, to develop a sense of who I am. What do I belong to? Who else belongs with me? That is, culture is about identity. I used the term, cultural membership and cultural citizenship a while ago. What this means is, I connect to other people because we share similar cultural practices, because we understand each other's cultural practices. So, for instance, all Indians recognize the national flag. How do we recognize the national flag? We were not born with a sense of what our national flag is. No, over a period of time from school, when you go to school for the Independence Day celebration or the Republic Day celebration, we say, that there is my country's flag. I belong to the country whose flag is this. The cultural practice of the national festival, the national symbol, the national song brings me into contact with the rest of the people who are also looking at the same flag. In other words, what we are looking at is the unification of people, the coming together of people by a common cultural practice. Having said that, let's quickly go back over what we have said by way of a summary. What does culture do is how we have concluded what we have been talking about. Culture brings us together in some kind of cultural membership, cultural citizenship, gives us a sense of identity. But in order to do so, it goes through a whole series of processes. Because the etymology of the word says to make, to endeavor, to do something, to make an effort, culture is rooted in the sense of manufacturing something. What it manufactures is a set of cultural practices. As we have already said, so I'll quickly summarize this. Cultural practices are divided into high and low, or mass and popular, where the culture of the economically powerful is established as the definite cultural standard, measured only by aesthetic means, and the other ones are relegated to the other side, which effectively means that culture is political because those who are culturally disempowered are also economically disenfranchised. That cultural differences are therefore also connected to economic differences. Culture can be of various kinds. It can be high, low, as I said, but also at the level of the group, which is folk culture, at the level of the larger nation, which is national culture, and it can be at the level of cities, regions, specific linguistic areas. And finally, there are those who resist the domination of upper class, say differently powerful racial cultures in order to establish their own, what we call subcultures. All of these processes require representation, by which I mean not just representation visually or verbally, but a whole range of representations. Cultures establish identity through these representations.